opening lines of communication and staking a claim in the center immediately. Opening the diagonal for the bishop and solidifying central presence, but potentially delaying development. Commanding the center now, white challenges black's pawn, aiming to seize more space and prepare rapid piece development. Challenging white's central pawns while preparing for rapid development. Asserting central control with the knight, preparing development and a potential pawn thrust. Preparing a fianchetto, this pawn push opens the bishop's diagonal, potentially controlling key central squares later. Aggressively staking claims in the center, this pawn push immediately challenges black's fianchettoed bishop and opens avenues for attacking the king. Developing the bishop to its longest diagonal immediately capitalizes on the open lines, putting pressure on white's center. Developing the knight here solidifies control of the center and prepares for castling, a prudent step in this evolving position. Securing the king's safety is paramount. This castle solidifies the monarch behind a pawn shield while preparing for potential central action. Developing the bishop here aims to support the central pawns and prepare for a kingside pawn storm, potentially opening lines towards black's castled king with the f-pawn advance. Retreating the knight to d7 aims to bolster the kingside defense and potentially reroute the knight to a more active square, perhaps c5 or even e5, after preparing it with moves like c6. This repositioning is a patient approach, prioritizing structural integrity over immediate aggression, and it allows black to prepare for a central pawn push or a queenside expansion later. Securing the king behind a pawn shield, this castling maneuver aims to bring the rook into play and consolidate white's central pawn structure, while also setting the stage for potential kingside attacking ideas by clearing the f1 square. This bold pawn thrust immediately challenges the center, creating dynamic imbalances and forcing white to decide on the central pawn structure. Opening the d-file immediately creates a central imbalance, forcing black to confront the pawn structure head-on rather than building a slow positional attack. This bold exchange offers white a clear advantage in central space and opens lines for aggressive piece play. Clearing the central d-file opens lines for both sides. Black now has the opportunity to develop their queenside pieces more freely while potentially undermining white's ambitious pawn center. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, white seeks to crack open black's defenses and exploit the king's slightly exposed position, aiming to create immediate attacking chances before black can fully consolidate. Solidifying central pawn control and preparing a queenside expansion, this move aims to counter white's aggressive pawn thrust, preventing it from achieving ultimate dominance in the center. Unleashing a knight toward the king side, white aims to exploit the potential weakness of the f7 square, setting up a potent attacking structure. Dislodging the knight from its comfortable defense of the d6 pawn, black aims to disrupt white's advancing pawn chain and perhaps seize control of the vital c5 square. This maneuver opens lines for the queenside pieces and challenges the king's flank, injecting dynamism into a position that was becoming somewhat static for black. Instigating queenside expansion immediately pressures black's pawn chain, aiming to pry open lines for white's pieces and potentially exploit weaknesses around the black king should it remain in the center or flank. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this move aims to curtail white's attacking potential along the queenside flank, creating a more stable defensive platform. Solidifying control over the central squares and preparing for a potential kingside advance, this maneuver also opens a diagonal for the queen to potentially join the attack, creating multifaceted pressure. Suddenly, the bishop embarks on an ambitious raid towards the kingside, seeking to exchange itself for the formidable knight on g5. This aggressive repositioning, while aiming to disrupt white's attacking potential, leaves a slight void in black's central pawn structure and opens lines that might otherwise remain blocked. Consider the long-term implications of this bishop's absence from the queenside defense and its impact on the potential for future pawn pushes. Aimed at solidifying the queenside and preparing a central pawn thrust, this maneuver cleverly reroutes the queen, anticipating potential pawn advances from black while offering support for a future f5-f6 push. This decision creates a significant pawn weakness on the king side, by opening the f-file, potentially sacrificing structural integrity for an elusive kingside attack, while simultaneously conceding central space and weakening the pawn chain leading to the castled king. Shifting the queen to f2 abandons the pressure on the d-file, allowing black's central pawns to breathe and potentially supporting f5 push later, while simultaneously preparing a potential kingside attack with the queen's eyes on h4 or g3. The dark-squared bishop, after a brief foray, now exits the stage, sacrificing itself to eliminate white's fearsome knight that was poised to invade the kingside. This exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a passed pawn for black on the f-file which might become a future target, but also opens the g-file towards white's king, although that's currently well defended. White's pawn mass on the kingside is now somewhat weakened by the absence of the bishop's defensive support on g7, and black will need to be mindful of the remaining potential for a kingside attack. Seizing the opportunity to disrupt black's pawn structure, white's bishop exchange opens the queenside and aims to exploit the weakened b-pawn on c6. The queen's journey to d7 aims to consolidate the kingside pawn structure and redeploy for potential counterplay along the d-file, while also preparing to defend the weakened e5 pawn if necessary. Unleashing a pin on the knight, white immediately targets the queenside development and puts pressure on the d-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the black king, once that knight is forced to move. Focusing on the queen's sudden inactivity, this retreat to the open file might seem passive, yet it subtly aims to reroute that crucial piece, potentially to the d7 square, to bolster the king's defenses and prepare for a central pawn push, offering an alternative to merely reacting to white's flank pressure. Probing for weaknesses around black's kingside, white initiates a pawn advance with a dual purpose, to disrupt black's defensive pawn chain and potentially open lines for attack. Black bravely repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, creating immediate pressure on white's kingside and challenging the recently established bishop pair. Creating a solid pawn structure around the king is crucial, and this move fortifies that defense while potentially opening a pathway for the rook on h1 later. Initiating this capture opens up the g-file, a critical pathway towards white's castled king, and fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating immediate potential for dynamic counterplay. Reopening the g-file immediately after recapturing the pawn, white aggressively challenges black's central structure. This aggressive pawn thrust is a clear signal of intent, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the queen and bishop, while simultaneously exposing black's king to potential threats. Black must carefully consider the consequences of this open avenue, as it could lead to a swift tactical skirmish. A desperate attempt to reopen lines for the queen and rook. However, this capture creates substantial weaknesses around the black king, particularly the e4 pawn's isolation and the exposed diagonal leading to the monarch. Unleashing a knight into the heart of black's weakened central structure creates a potent attacking force, directly challenging key squares and aiming to exploit the discovered weaknesses stemming from the earlier pawn advances. The king finds a slightly safer haven, a temporary respite as the central pawn structure remains fractured and the opponent's knight looms, hinting at potential raids. Pushing the f-pawn further intensifies the kingside battle, aiming to pry open lines towards black's castled monarch and challenge the pawn chain's integrity. Consider the potential weaknesses this creates. While aspiring to create attacking chances, the advance might leave the e4 square vulnerable to black's pieces and commit white's pawn structure prematurely. The geometric implication is a tightening of the central space for white, attempting to reassert control after black's recent pawn thrusts. However, black's pieces are poised to exploit any overextension. This aggressive pawn push is a clear signal of white's intention to attack, rather than consolidate, gambling on the open files and potential weaknesses in black's king's safety. Observe the delicate balance. White gains attacking potential but risks overextending and weakening their own position if black can successfully counterplay through the open diagonals and central pawn breaks. The knight's journey to a6 strategically prepares its re-entry into the fray on c7, aiming to contest the d5 square and disrupt white's central ambitions. Opening a vital diagonal for the queen and bishops, this capture aims to dismantle black's pawn structure and exploit the weakened king's shelter. Opening up that b-file now grants black some much-needed counterplay, potentially freeing the rook and activating the queen, though it does create a permanent weakness on the b6 square that white's knight might eye later. Securing the monarch's safety becomes paramount. Placing the king on the second rank, a traditional refuge, frees up the g-file for potential defensive maneuvers or a tactical regrouping, while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable pawn advances and piece exchanges that lie ahead.